Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Rally DNA podcast. This week's episode is another in our retrospective series, this time centered upon one of the undoubted heavy hitters of the WRC calendar, Rally Portugal. Joining me to help dissect a pair of classic Iberian events is my co-host and Irish rallying guru, Cillian Cronin. Cillian, what first comes to your mind when someone mentions Rally Portugal to you?
Well, I suppose it's one of these ones that really evokes that image of and I suppose I put this in my segment as well, that it's this one that's really, excuse me, the parting of the Red Sea with the crowds. Okay, obviously it has had a poor reputation of spectator safety, and obviously that infamous event in '86. But right up into the '90s, it still looked like that. But it is, the stages always look really good. It's it's always been, it seems to have thrown up no share of thrillers, as it were. So I think in terms of, I suppose we probably both had a similar issue with picking something for this because there's quite a few you could pick. Um, it's had quite a few multiple winners. It's one of the oldest rounds of the championship, as well. It's had two drivers to win it five times as well, so it's had a few guys kind of dominated over the years, but I think ultimately it's cars coming over the Fafe jump or something like that, and just you know sheer massive numbers of people lining the stages and scarcely millimeters from cars as they go past.
Absolutely, mate. Couldn't agree more. And I think we probably both had the same opinion when researching, doing notes for this, is the crowd control issue. And I suppose if you want to be generous, you'd call it passionate crowds. But when I knew it persisted, it didn't end with Group B, but certainly, my God, it persisted long into the 90s, didn't it?
Far, far too long. And while it is, it does add something to when you're watching old footage of it. It does. You have to kind of stop yourself, and you're like, oh, that looks, that would be great to be there and see that. And then you do have to wind yourself back a few years further back and go, well, there's a reason it really shouldn't be like that. And look, we've both spectated many's the rally over the years, and we know the risks involved. It did seem to prolong
Mm.
itself a lot in Portugal. And although it does have a bit of a romantic element to it because of that, you do have to consider, and it's very important to consider that there's a very good reason why things like that shouldn't be seen again.
Absolutely. Um, Portugal has been a fixture of the WRC calendar for generations, and while it might not have quite the same cachet as the likes of the Monte or even the Tour de Corse, every ardent long-term rally fan recognises it as among the finest gravel events Europe has to offer. What's more, Portugal has served up more than its fair share of drama, intrigue, and adverse weather over the years, with many of the most consequential incidents taking place in the modern era. In short, there's plenty for Killy and myself to select from, and we hope that you guys approve of our choices. First, though, a brief word from our sponsors, Slip and Grip Automotive. Slip and Grip Automotive is a UK-based motorsport events organizer and members club with a diverse roster of events to its name, including a impressive selection of rally sprints and test dates. These are all run from its fabulous base of operations in West Wales, the Bont Rally Stage, one that's representative of many of the tarmac special stages commonly encountered in the UK and Ireland. It makes a compelling case for any competitor seeking to be better prepared for their next competitive outing, and is therefore ideal for those of you seeking to blow the cobwebs of your pride and joy in the weeks and months leading up to a rally. I have plumped for the 1998 running of Rally Portugal, mainly because it's one that I recall watching at the time as a rally obsessed 10-year-old, and watching in the best way you could back then, which meant, you know, watching it a few days later and reading about it in Motorsport News and Autosport, because I'm an old codger. Um, uh, but it's one that I have very, very vivid memories of. And a big part of that at the time was because it was pure vintage McRae grist, certainly in terms of their pro drive years. And it was a rally that I, as a WRC zealot with an unabashed partisan leanings towards McRae and Subaru, embraced unashamedly. Um,
Something you've never alluded to before as well. You wear your heart on your sleeve when it comes to your '90s passion for McRae,
well, yeah, it's a bit more, you know,
the Scottish blood.
Oh, no, it's a bit more tempered these days because I've got a more, rounded adult approach to his career and what he achieved. But back then, it was, yeah, it was. I think I've said before, I was, genuinely annoyed that he departed Subaru for Ford for '99. Uh, um, Naive as it undoubtedly was, I emerged from the '98 running of Rally Portugal with the cast iron conviction that it would be McRae and Grist crowned as World Rally Championships come the end of the year. Little did I know quite how unpredictable the remainder of that season would turn out to be. um, Other personal highlights from this instalment include a revitalised Juha Kankkunen, seemingly one with the Escort WRC and able to haul the rapidly aging machine further up the timesheets that most would have deemed credible. And one of the final, or indeed the last appearance in Works Guys of the Evergreen Evo 4. Of course, the car with which Tommy achieved so much in the previous season. Always seemed to kick around for a lot longer in Works Guys, that particular Evo, than the cold hard stats
Does, doesn't
portray.
it?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know. It's maybe it's because I spend too much time looking at rallies from '96 and '97, but
Could be a bit of that in there. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it did. I mean, ultimately, yeah.
yeah. So in short, I've selected 1998 because of what it represents. My own formative interest in rallying or the WRC, the still new 2 litre World Rally Championship regulations, and a roster of drivers that I kind of hero worshipped and occasionally watched in person at the time. So it's peak formative WRC for me.
Right.
This is the 32nd running of Rally Portugal, and as usual, it was based out of Porto, with much of its 380 kilometres competitive mileage, located in the southeast and the east of that city. The usual mix of flowing, tricky gravel and lots of big old boulders, a bit of sharp bedrock to catch up the unwary. And I've actually put a note in here saying, as we've already covered, about how bonkers some of the onboard footage looks. I mean, there's a bit I found, it's mentioned in the WRC official recap, but I found on it wasn't YouTube, some other YouTube upload site, an onboard of Kankkunen when he won SS8, and it looks for all the world like Portugal in the mid '80s. It's properly scary stuff, and I mean,
It does look like it's stuff from 10 years before. Like there's someone's just inserted footage of an Impreza or whatever into it.
and the bad old days of people jumping out with a disposable camera to get a really shit grainy photo of an Impreza WRC coming towards them, then jumping out the way at the last moment. It's like bloody hell.
I'd love to see not only grainy, but probably they have to move so fast that there's no way it captures anything that resembles nothing more than a blur, you know.
Yeah, that's Subaru blue and gold. I promise you. Um, Speaking of Subaru, the opening years of the 2 litre WRC era saw ProDrive and Subaru at the peak of their combined powers, and boy, did it show in Portugal. The team had a pair of S5 Impreza WRCs, one for McRae and Grist, the other for Piero Leati and Fabrizio Pons. A pairing clearly heavily biased in the favour of the former, yet one highly regarded and reckoned to be amongst the best rounded in the service park at the time. As for the car, well, the '98 Impreza was a certified icon the moment it appeared. Beautifully proportioned and still oozing with menace. No car, in my opinion, has better suited British American Tobacco's iconic blue and gold, and precious few have commanded as much stage presence. Was also technologically progressive, famously so, and perhaps a bit too progressive in some respects. It's infamously for suspect reliability, which daunted Dog McRae throughout '97 and various points in 1998. Indeed, McRae had failed to finish in either of the preceding duo of rallies, Sweden and Kenya, and this mechanical frailty, best showcased by the infamous bumpy bit in the middle of the Impreza's rev range, would haunt the Scot for the remainder of the year, ultimately thwarting his championship aspirations. Ford, you could have been forgiven for thinking that Ford's 1998 would have been little more than a holding operation, a chance for the team to gather itself in readiness for the launch of the Focus the following season, and with it the recruitment of one Colin McRae, but not a bit of it. In fact, the M Sport operation was punching above its weight in the manner we've seen and become accustomed to in recent years. The outfit able to squeeze every last ounce of performance potential from the now rather elderly Escort WRC, all in an attempt to keep the likes of Toyota and Subaru honest. Portugal would demonstrate the car's inherent pace and, for the most part, reliability. Sadly, when those reliability issues did make themselves known, they tended to do so at vital points, something team leader Juha Kankkunen would and could attest to. As we'll soon see, the Finn's performance in Portugal must rank as among the most impressive of the latter portion of his career, at least in my view. So much so that he probably could have finished a fine second overall had his Escort not elected to take inspiration from its earlier namesakes and revert to rear-wheel drive for a goodly portion of Saturday. Ford's ambitions in Portugal were aided by Ari Vatanen back at M Sport for the second event on the bounce, super subbing for Bruno Thierry, who broke a few ribs in the recce for the Safari. And I must admit, I did some digging on this because I couldn't. I mean, all I remembered was that Thierry did himself a mischief, and I couldn't remember what the reason. But this was on. I found on a 1998 ancient web page from crash.net, as in still archived, and it said that he did it from sitting in the back of a caged recce car for the Safari driven by Kankkunen, and Kankkunen hit a pothole too quickly. And because Thierry was unbelted, apparently, as far as the description reads, basically spider monkeying himself in the back of the car, he slipped and managed to sort of crack his ribs on the inside on one of the bits of the car. Which, I mean,
That sounds traumatic.
it does, and I mean, it might be hokum as well, but it also sounds almost too good to not be true. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure someone here one of our listeners will be able to put me right if I'm wrong.
Just don't let anything get in the way of a good story.
Well,
Uh,
exactly that.
yeah,
Yeah.
we,
Well,
we'll reach out to Bruno for comment. Uh,
how are the ribs? um,
Sounds like a terrible idea, though, in the first place.
Absolutely, especially
I'm
in Kenya as well. I mean,
not renowned for smoothness.
um, so yes, Audi Vatanen back, having done such a stellar job in Kenya, and back, yeah, in an Escort WRC in Portugal.
So got
Mitsubishi, sorry, go on.
an aging Finnish duo in the escorts, then kind of
An aging Finnish duo in an aging Ford rally car.
yeah.
They are.
I mean, when you consider that 20 it would have been 20 years previously, Vatanen was doing escort based exploits
Yeah, yeah, and
in and you think of the gap between as well, just from a Mark II escort to an escort, a Group 4 Mark II escort to an escort WRC.
but it speaks to Portugal's longevity as an event, as you mentioned earlier, that it's the same event that he was doing it on,
Huh.
and could be now if he felt so inclined. There aren't many that you could rely on as such a fixture.
No,
Um, Mitsubishi and Ralliart were another outfit with one eye fixed firmly on the months ahead, with the new Evo 5 expected to make its works debut on the very next event in Spain. Until then, it was a case of making do with the trusty Evo 4, a car by no means outclassed come this point in time, but certainly looking a mite overshadowed when compared to the technological tour de forces employed by Subaru and Toyota. Rugby's finest could at least call upon the talents of one Tommy Mäkinen, a man beset with frustration due to the mixed manner in which his title defence had started. Yes, he'd taken his almost customary victory in Sweden, but this had been bracketed by non-scores in both the Monte and the Safari, and his championship ambitions were looking somewhat threadbare as a result. Yes, the chips were down, and Mäkinen needed ideally a strong result from Portugal to bolster said title ambitions. And then his teammate was none other than Richard Burns, who came to Portugal flush with success, having claimed his first WRC victory weeks beforehand on the Safari. Score he was doubtless keen to replicate as soon as possible. He and Robert Reid would ultimately have to settle for somewhat less, but it would nevertheless be a productive event for the pair and their Charisma GT branded Evo, which, if you know anything about me, you'll know that I really, really love the fact that it was based as a charisma GT and a sort of really hackneyed marketing exercise. You
Yes,
know,
I do enjoy a bit of odd odd homologation marketing nous, you know. Yeah.
oh yeah, I mean that would, it didn't fly back then really, but it would never fly now. Can you imagine? It's a measure of how much more savvy your average car buyer is that they don't just fall for rebadged toot like that.
Yeah. One of those charisma GTs, please. No, no, no,
um,
that's not what he drove.
1998 marked Toyota's first full season or complete season with the Corolla WRC, and thus TTE's first works complete year since the infamous events of 1995. Not that anyone in the team was looking backwards at the time, not now it was clear just how effective a rally car the Corolla WRC was shaping up to be when placed in the hands of drivers Carlos Sainz and Didier Auriol. Sainz had taken victory in the opening round of the season, the Monte, and followed it up with second in Sweden. While suspension failure forced him and Luis Moya out of the Safari, the duo was still looking well placed for a title assault. Teammate Oriel's 98 had been less emphatically brilliant, but had nevertheless showed promise, most notably with a fine second from his own visit to East Africa. There was also a third Corolla WRC present in Portugal, this one driven by Freddie Loix, with backing from Toyota Belgium and, as ever with Fast Freddie in this period, Marlboro tobacco sponsorship. Loix had driven superbly to end the previous running of the rally in second place overall at the wheel of a Celica GT4, and no doubt sought to replicate the feat in 1998. The first leg of the rally consisted of 10 stages with a total competitive combined mileage of 134.66 kilometers. The rally kicked off on the Sunday night or Sunday afternoon with a super special stage, the Lusuda super special stage based at the old rallycross track. And if you've seen videos from this event or even photos, there's quite a few in like the old McLean Rallycars book. It's quite impressive because there's this vast bank of spectators, which for a long time when I was a kid, I didn't twig was at a super special stage. I just thought it must be some particularly hilly section of a special stage, but it is the super special. And yeah, you look at the onboards or even just the exterior camera angles, and it's quite impressive. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of people, tens of meters above the cars. Yeah, looks like quite a good space to watch a rally, I must say. But yeah, predictably drew massive spectators. Oriel quickest through SSS1 by a mere 0.2 seconds, and then himself less than a second ahead of Colin McRae in third. First proper stage took place on Monday morning with Marcus Gronholm quickest, the Santa Quitera 1 stage. He led McRae by 4.3 seconds as most of the other championship hopefuls opted to steadily drive themselves into the rally in a more conservative fashion. It was the next stage, the run from, by the way, there's going to be sorry to our Portuguese listeners, there's going to be our usual butchery or my usual butchery of Portuguese. So,
I don't
and,
know,
and
but I don't
then
think you haven't butchered Portuguese yet, so maybe it's just an additional butchery.
additional butchery, exactly. And all our Brazilian listeners will be up in arms as well. But yes, so SS3, the classic blast from Faf to Lamirhirina. Either way, McRae absolutely blitzed it. He was 9 seconds ahead of second place man Kankkunen at the Escort, and it kind of set the tone for how Colin would approach the remainder of the day and indeed the rally. He claimed 5 out of the 7 remaining stages, fastest times. The only blots on his copybook being input from Kankkunen and Freddie Loix on SS8 and SS9, respectively. The only issue, as far as McRae was concerned, occurred later in the day when there was perceived lack of mid-range punch from the Impreza's boxer. And while intensive efforts at the final service of the day uncovered nothing untoward, the uncertainty served to make McRae feel less than confident going to the second leg. And this despite, spoiler here, him going into that leg with a massive 44-second advantage. Kankkunen spent his morning consolidating second place, in which was aided by third place Carlos Sainz struggling with the handling of his Corolla WRC. Sainz complained of a vague front end and general feeling of twitchiness, and he spent much of that opening day attempting to dial out these wayward traits through various suspension tweaks. I think it's a measure of how consummate professional Sainz is and was, especially back then. That he never, and you can see he never lets his chin droop, despite having, by all accounts, driving what must be a fairly terrible car at times. Well, not terrible innately, but certainly in terms of the setup, it wasn't to his liking, and yet still there in a damage limitation mode throughout the opening leg. While emphatically shaded by McRae, Kankkunen's drive was an impressive one all the same. He made his second overall his own by setting fastest time of all through SS8, the 22 kilometers of Viju, and this is the particularly hairy onboard. I'll try and dig out and put on our social media. It's pretty grainy, but it's most of the stage, and I mean, you can watch it and be impressed with how Kankkunen's driving, which is the easy thing, but also there's a lot of, as we've said, locals doing the full Latin and jumping out to take grainy photos.
What's worse, the butchery of the names or saying full Latin? I don't know what the implications are. Well, in the meantime, while you've been talking, I have checked, and there was in the last 3 months, like there's been 6 downloads for the podcast in Portugal, and I appreciate we haven't been very active lately, but we might be safe.
I'm sorry to you 6 guys. I genuinely and
well, that's 6 downloads, so that could be the one guy probably.
Well,
So.
exactly, yeah, and well, yeah, but it's the one guy. His Latin temperament will ensure that he gets really upset at me.
You don't want him to go full Latin on you, no. Do we have to cut this out?
I was going to say, oh dear.
Oh God. Are we just getting ourselves taken off lists for getting into these countries?
Sorry, I'll stop. For his part, Mäkinen spent a good portion of the opening leg squabbling with Sainz over third place. And while the Finn did initially appear to have seized the initiative, he had no answer for Sainz's blistering speed once the Toyota man had rendered the car more to his liking, at least on the opening leg. Sainz got faster as the leg progressed and ultimately consolidated his grip on third, with one eye doubtless on legs 2 and 3. For his part, Mäkinen couldn't be too disappointed with his performance on that first day. He ended it secure in fourth, sandwiched between Sainz and Loix, and seemingly with good chance of making inroads on the podium as the rally progressed. Loix was one of the stars of that opening leg, demonstrating that his drive to second here last year was no fluke. And he set about trying to repeat the feat, this time in a box fresh Corolla WRC. He'd end the day fifth overall, and while still a full 15 seconds behind Mäkinen, he was at least a man in the form of his career, having demonstrated his pace in no uncertain terms. Oriol had a pig of an event, and despite that first initial fastest stage time, it all went downhill from there. Various transmission issues, and eventually it just the Corolla refused to stay in gear, and he would retire on the second leg, SS17. As for Burns and Piero Leati, they had solid rather than spectacular opening legs, respectively, although the former had displayed flashes of the speed which is seen in best all challenges last time out in Kenya. The attacking manner with which Burns tackled the opening test of the second leg merely underlined the fact that he'd been keeping his powder dry and also he had ample pace in reserve. Next up, the second leg, which was 10 stages of combined competitive mileage, totaling 144.9 kilometers. This first stage, the first test was an 8-kilometer blast through Lusoda to Compello. And at first it appeared as if Mäkinen had the stuff to commence his much anticipated vault up the leaderboard. He was fastest of all through that stage, just ahead of fellow countryman Kankkunen, but it wasn't to last. The very next stage, Mäkinen's Evo stepped out the exit of a fast right-hand corner and was pulled into the surrounding woodland at speed. He managed to keep the car from pirouetting into the trees, but couldn't stop it from rotating, nor from exiting the stage, and with it the rally. Wasn't the biggest crash, but it was certainly very much terminal as far as the car was concerned. and left him with 3 retirements from the opening 4 rallies. Not how you'd have expected him or wanted him to make his title defence, you would assume. And it's a measure of just how topsy-turvy the 98 season turned out to be that he would eventually succeed in defending it. Richard Burns and Freddie Loix, of course, both benefited from the demise of the lead Evo, though in truth both had more than deserved promotion up the order on pace and merit alone. Loix netted a slew of second fastest times on the opening morning, while Burns, no doubt seeking to soothe Mitsubishi's disappointment at the loss of Mäkinen, was quickest on SS13 and SS14 to briefly hold third place overall. This is the point when Oriol's Corolla decided quite enough of selecting gears and decided to become quite an attractive piece of street furniture instead, much to his disappointment. And another man with a mix of happiness and disappointment, you'd assume, was McRae, who was yet again fastest on SS12, but found his charge hobnailed by a puncher 3 kilometres from the end of SS14, the Tabula stage. There's an interview with McRae complaining that the tyre mousse had failed to activate. And as a result, McRae lost the thick end of 30 seconds of what had formerly been an almost 1 minute long advantage. He'd still end the leg with an advantage. He'd still end the leg with an advantage and still in the lead, but it'd be trimmed to just over 11 seconds. Second place Kankkunen was not immune from second leg drama either. Triple K had generally been keeping the likes of Saints, Loix and McRae honest and maintained second overall in the process, but transmission issues made themselves felt on SS17 and he hemorrhaged time as a result, falling down to 5th by stage end. The very next service revealed a mashed pinion bearing on the front differential, and with not enough time to simply conduct a like-for-like swap, the M-Sport mechanics opted to remove the front drive shaft, effectively converting the Escort to rear-wheel drive, which you'd assume must have done wonders for Kankkunen's lurid slides on gravel, but probably not for his times. Well, definitely not for his times. It spelt the end of his podium ambitions. For his part, Sainz was becoming quicker and quicker as that second leg ticked by. He set fastest time on SS16 to cement his grip on third place, and he could well have perhaps gone further still had an intermittent ABS issue robbed him of stopping power on the closing stages of the day. Another factor in Sainz's inability to escape the bottom step of the podium was the form of Freddie Loix, who was fastest of all on stages 17 through 20 to end the leg in second overall, just 11 seconds behind McRae and the lead Corolla WRC driver. I know I have talked a lot about Loix in this podcast, often perhaps in unfair terms, but I mean, stuff like this, you can see how anyone watching in the late 90s would have felt fairly comfortable in putting a bet on him being maybe not a world champion, but certainly, a multiple event winner in the future.
Someone in the fight.
Anyway. Yeah, quick on gravel, quick on tarmac. Knew his way around a new world rally car. Yeah. So on to the final, third and final stage, leg rather, which consisted of 9 stages with a combined mileage of just 100.58 kilometers over 8 stages. McRae was just second fastest through the opening test of the day, which was the Lasuda Compello run, 8 kilometers of it. He had to cede best to Sainz, although obviously the Scots still had to keep one eye on the other Corolla of Loix. It was a classic case of there being far too much at stake for McRae to drive at anything approaching full commitment until the chasing backpack began to very slowly erode his lead as the day wore on. As for Loix, he was again fastest through SS24, to retain second place overall for now, but he had no answer for McRae's ballistic times and fell away as the leg progressed, his course not helped by gear selection issues of his own. He'd ultimately have to be content with third spot overall in the final reckoning. Loix was relieved of second by rejuvenated Sainz on SS25, which the Spaniard won at a canter. Did the same on SS27 to set himself and everyone else up for a thrilling last-minute assault on McRae's lead. And so McRae commenced the final stage of the rally, the 11 kilometers of Amarante, with a buffer of just 6.8 seconds, a far cry from the 1 minute long advantage he'd had earlier on in the event. Um, and it was pretty close stuff. In the end, it was Sainz who was fastest, perhaps predictably, given that he had nothing to lose, and he claimed the stage by 4.7 seconds, enough to take the stage, but not enough to overhaul McRae for the lead, with the Scots' ultimate victory margin a scant 2.1 seconds. Further down the order, Burns came home in fourth, Vatten in fifth, and with it the lead escort WRC, while Liatti overcame Parizia Pond's lost voice to claim sixth overall, while Kankkunen had to be content with just seventh. I've always the various commentaries, I've delved into it. Apparently, this gives nothing more about the ProDrive doctor managed to bring her voice back. I want to know about what last minute voice coaching you can do to retrieve a co-driver's lost voice on the final day of a 3 leg rally. I mean,
That that would be an interesting question to get answered.
I've seen the King's Speech, and I imagine it just involves, gargling marbles and smoking or something. I don't know.
Here's a large whiskey.
Take three of these. Um, yes, and of course, Sainz had to be content with second. And in the grand scheme of things, it's hindsight's a wonderful thing. But those extra points, if he had managed to overcome McRae, would have been fairly handy in the ultimate championship reckoning. Though, of course, he would have had to have he lost out to Mackinnon by just 2 points. Though, of course, he would have to have a draw would presumably still have seen Mackinnon crowned as champion on count back because Mackinnon would have
One
won
more event.
events, like 3 or 4 to Carlos's 2. So, but either way, close stuff, and yeah, a really thrilling rally. Just yeah, for me, it's everything. It's my favorite rally cars, give or take. My favorite crop of drivers, and it's impossible to separate the significance of watching it from afar at the time, really.
Yeah, like you say, it's a great selection of cars that year anyway, in general, isn't it, as well? An interesting point you made actually when you mentioned box fresh Corolla, it just put something into my mind. The Corolla was probably the best Toyota rally car from new, as in, it was competitive right from its first and second events, say. Um,
Yeah, didn't
because it,
Gronholm get a podium with it in '97? I think in Finland. I think
yeah, they were all the Celicas early on were either tricky or downright slow
or
compared to their
hot.
peers. Mm,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, you look at an SD205, and it's I think what Kankkunen did the first event in Australia and really hated it and struggled with it. Um,
yeah. More on that
SD165
later.
was well, exactly. Yes, of course. So yes, that's my choice. Killian, over to you. What have you chosen?
So I've gone for 95. Although I know 95 is probably one of those years in the championship that gets talked about quite a lot. Um, this running of Portugal did speak to me somewhat as well, so I've opted for that one. Um, so this was the 29th running of Rally Portugal in 95. In its traditional home area, although it started a bit further away from Estoril than it normally did. Um, it's round three on the 8 round calendar for 1995. The opening round in Monte Carlo had been won by Subaru's Carlos Sainz, whose teammate Colin McRae retired on that event, while round two in Sweden had been won by local man Kenneth Eriksson on one of his selected events at Rally Art this season. Sainz had in fact retired in the previous round, so was raring to go, arriving in Portugal, having won here before in 1991 and hoping for a repeat to go for another championship victory in this year. Um, in fact, Subaru as a team had a weekend to forget in Sweden that year, as all three cars had failed to complete the rally, all because of engine issues. Each of the four manufacturers would field three cars for the event, except Rally Art Group A cars were not there. The top seeded Mitsubishis were, in fact, Rally Art Germany Group N cars. The top seeds saw Didier Auriol first on the road, 1994 world champion, followed by Juha Kankkunen and Nicky Grist, also in a Celica, and Armin Schwartz, the number three car.
Friend
Also
of
in
the
a
pod.
friend of the pod, Armin Schwartz. Followed by Colin McRae, Carlos Sainz, and Richard Burns, all in Imprezas. And Delacour, Francois Delacour, in his traditional Ford at that point, with Bruno Thierry and Alex Fiorio. Very inexperienced Alex Fiorio, actually, or rather, out of practice Alex Fiorio at that point, rather than inexperienced, maybe
Mm,
an unkind word, but hadn't done much rallying of late at that point. And
mm,
also Richard Burns, it was Richard Burns's first event in 3 months, actually, when he sat behind the wheel of the Impreza on this
mm.
round. Um, so the Fords as well also might be notable to point out that these were now RAS ran cars. Obviously, Boreham and Ford had hit fairly financial troubles in the previous year. The closure of Boreham had been announced by this point, but it had kind of been given a stay of execution to prepare the escorts, although Theory's car would actually be prepared in Belgium for some of the season as well. So kind of an odd setup there before, obviously, M Sport swooped in a couple of years' time. The rally would consist of 33 all gravel stages over 482 competitive kilometres, though the rally saw two stages cancelled at one point on the last day, ending up just over 100 kilometres less than the 1994 running of the event, with cracking Group A lampods making an appearance for night stages throughout the weekend. Sainz, Kankinen, and Delacour had all won here in the past, so the event was shaping up to be a classic round right from the off. Coming into the event, there was talks that Subaru had turned down the wick on the Impreza's engine following the Swedish shocker to try and preserve reliability. Toyota had announced an electronics upgrade, in finger quotes, giving a cure for their lack of pace on the opening two rounds in the new ST205 Celica. Like, it's important to note at this point that the Celica has had been nowhere on the first two events. Pace was not really there at all.
Wasn't this? Didn't Toyota was saying trying to were underlining the idea that their pace advantage wasn't a pace advantage, and it was purely because of
Subaru had
Subaru
turned it down.
turning. Yeah,
But it turns out I don't think Subaru had actually not done that at all, apparently. So, yeah.
skullduggery in the 90s,
Mm.
rallying skullduggery. Well, I never.
And Ove Anderson looks like such a trustworthy chap. Yeah. As mentioned earlier, an event not well known for its spectator safety. The crowds in this event would be no better than the days when lives had been lost there, with onboard still showing crowds parting like the Red Sea before oncoming cars. Images perhaps more closely associated with days from the previous decade. Although, to be honest, as we've already mentioned, that those images were still a factor in the 90s, right the way up till really the turn of the century. Obviously, we now think of 95 as a stellar year for the 555 liveried Imprezas, but coming into this round, they weren't looking that great. I know Carlos had done well in Monte, but the Impreza, it had been troublesome. Obviously, the Sweden was a shocker, but they hadn't been that quick so far. The opening leg on Friday would consist of 9 stages over 177 kilometres. The new and totally legally improved Celicas were quickest off the blocks, with Kankinen setting the fastest time on the opening test at Tabua, followed by teammate Didier Auriol, whose time was more or less matched by Carlos Sainz. Two of the now RAS ran Fords followed in fourth and fifth fastest, with Delacour just 6 seconds off the Toyota of KKK on stage one. Sainz did drop back a bit on stage two in his now perhaps underpowered Impreza, while Kankinen took another stage win, the second of what will become 5 out of 9 on the first leg. 1993 winner Francois Delacour would match Kankinen's time on stage two, with Auriol just 1 second shy and the Toyota pair remaining in a 1-2 position. With Sainz dropping 3 seconds back from the leader to sit now 5 seconds off, which isn't bad considering how he felt that the car didn't have the power to match the Toyotas whatsoever. It was another win for Cankers on stage three, 4 seconds quicker than Auriol and 5 seconds ahead of Sainz to extend his lead to 10 seconds overall, while Colin McRae, who had been somewhat off the pace, managed to set a top three time for the first time that day. Delacour, meanwhile, his day took a turn for the worse as he took a cut and clipped a rock on quite a slow corner on stage three, rolling the car in one of those almost slow motion rolls that's almost more agonizing to watch for it.
Crunchy one.
Some helpful spectators were on hand to get the car back on all four wheels again, but Delacour and co-driver Catherine Francois had to take a long drive back to service with no windscreen. With the Escort looking worse for wear heading out to the next loop, it had gotten a new steering rack, but the RAS mechanics didn't have time to finish the job, and John Taylor, team manager, had stated that he wasn't going back out with power steering. The top five going into stage four were Kankinen, Oriel, Sainz, McRae, and Bruno Thierry, with 36 seconds separating first from fifth already. Delacour would complete stage four, but would retire on the following stage with oil starvation issues, perhaps as a result of dumping oil on his roll earlier. Stage four did see Carlos Sainz claim a first stage win of the event, 3 seconds quicker than Kankinen, and with McRae a further second back, starting to find his feet here. Stage five saw all three Toyotas set the top three times, followed by the Subarus of Sainz and McRae, with 11 seconds now separating Kankinen and Sainz, and all three Toyotas in the top five overall. Stage six saw another Toyota 1-2 for KKK and Oriel, putting Oriel back into second place after another stage win on stage seven. It seemed like there'd be no stopping the Salikas this weekend, but as day turned to night and the Lampard shod cars wound their way back to service after some night stages, it would be Carlos Sainz somehow leading the rally by 6 seconds, something he wouldn't have believed possible if you'd asked him that morning. Juha Kankinen had bent his steering arm after an encounter with one of those pesky Portuguese boulders earlier on, allowing the Spaniard to leapfrog him into the lead, and Oriel had lost even more time than his Finnish teammate on the last stage of the day. Sainz said that night that he had no problem being the one to open the road the following day, and there was an 8 a.m. start at the Lusada Rallycross track featuring some tarmac and gravel for the cars to face off two at a time and broadcast live on Portuguese TV, which was somewhat of a novelty back then. You really didn't get live coverage of the championship at all. A couple of times a year, maybe, if you were lucky.
Mm.
All three Toyotas set an identical time on this circuit before heading back to the thronged stages proper. Cankers managed to turn his 6 second deficit into a 4 second one, and Sainz's road position on stage 13 didn't help him hold the lead for long, with Oriel taking a stage win and Kankinen taking the lead back from El Matador before completing stage 14, which was Fafe 2, with a 5 second advantage to second place Sainz. So it didn't take him long really to turn around his 6 second
No.
disadvantage, did it, with his electronics upgrade.
They can't see you doing those air quotes.
It wasn't all fun for the Toyotas, however, as Colin McRae took a stage win on 15, which was Lullyhas 2, I'm guessing. That's how you pronounce it. And also be elevated to third overall. Though at this point, it was really looking like a complete two-horse race between Kankinen and Sainz, as the Scot was over a minute behind the top two, now followed by Oriel, who had lost over a minute having rolled on the second run over Fafe. It hadn't been a good start to the season for McRae, who really needed a strong finish here to keep any title hopes alive. Kankinen and co-driver Nicky Grist would go fastest over the next two stages, while Carlos Sainz would later say he was perhaps taking far too many risks to try and stay in touching distance of the flying Finn. With 3 stages left in the day and night falling, Sainz was 10 seconds off the leader. Oriel would claw back some time toward McRae with the fastest time on stage 19, while the remaining two saw a stage win apiece for the leaders. Another 5 fastest times on day two for Juha Kankinen. Sainz claimed at the end of the day he saw no chance for victory, with a 22-second gap to be made up. It seemed Toyota could prepare to celebrate a third win here in Portugal for Juha Kankinen. But, as Ove Anderson pointed out, rain was forecast, and it could be a long day ahead. Meanwhile, at the overnight halt, when Kankinen was asked on camera about where the extra power came from, he pointed at his bicep and said, "From here." Day three did indeed bring rain, and lots of it. This was a big issue for the Michelin-shod Toyotas, while the Pirelli-clad Imprezas now had a chance to make their bid for points. It wasn't rain so much as downpours, and with 147 kilometers over 12 stages to go, it was now Subaru's chance to pounce. McRae would take the first stage win of the day, a comfortable 4 seconds clear of Schwartz and 7 ahead of Kankinen, whose time was matched by Sainz, now with the bit between his teeth and maybe taking back his words of no chance, having seen the rain-filled clouds getting up that morning. The second stage of the day saw Sainz take 14 seconds out of Kankinen's lead, dramatically chopping it down to 8 seconds. While McRae's third place was now looking very, very comfortable, a minute ahead of previous year's world champion Didier Auriol.
That's a monster of a time in terms of, science there. Fair play. I mean, I know tyres and weather, but still, I'd love to see an onboard from that.
Yeah, I mean the footage looks incredible from that third day. Like it doesn't seem like you can actually see the pace disadvantage the Toyotas are at on this poor footage, and the Imprezas look like they're just really comfortable. Stage 24 was cancelled, but 25 saw fired up Signs take another 4 seconds from a Kankinen who was now seemingly powerless to stop this late charge, despite Mitchell and staff cutting tyres in an effort to get any extra grip that was on the table. It was clear that Pirelli was the superior tyre in these conditions and by some margin. But it wasn't over yet. Kankinen managed to increase his lead by 7 seconds on stage 26, now back to 11 seconds, and won again on stage 28, with 27 having been cancelled also. Sainz now had 5 stages to close the gap and give Subaru their first ever win in Portugal. No mean feat against a driver like Kankinen. Schwartz would claim his second stage win of the event on 29, but importantly for Sainz, he reduced the gap to 9 seconds. And by the end of the next stage, with Sainz having once again taken a huge chunk of time from the leading Toyota, he was now level with Juha Kankinen. Now he went on to secure his victory, winning the final 3 stages and with no shortage of drama still to come for him. Leaving nothing on the table, Sainz ditched his spare tyre going into the final 3 stages, or the final stage. And only less than 3 kilometres in, he would sever his front brake line, leaving him to do the final 7 kilometres, 7 and a bit kilometres of the last stage with only his rear brakes. And somehow he still gained time on that stage over Kankinen and winning the event by over 12 seconds.
I mean, it's
Um,
just vintage Carlos stuff, isn't it? I mean, it's just quiet brilliance and perseverance and yeah.
what an absolute hero. Like that is crazy stuff. Like he thought like he pulled up when they finished the stage, he thought they'd lost the rally. Like he was almost despondent, except the car was mobbed by Spanish fans and spraying champagne. And Luis Moya said to Cruz back in Park Ferme that Carlos told me we had no brakes, and I told him, Carlos, we are still going to win, even with our brakes. I always believe in God, and even more when we have to win, and we are going to win. We nearly went off the road, and I'm not lying, maybe 10 times, but still we managed. Incredible. That should be
Oh,
framed somewhere.
oh
Like,
yeah.
I mean, it must be like that stage alone has to be like a top, like one of the top tier Signs performances, and he's a few. But that is nuts stuff. Like 7K with the rear brakes, and as we know, like the rear brakes aren't up to much. You know,
No,
they're not your dominant
you're not your
performance
primary
stopping power.
stopping things. Yeah.
No, no. Um,
Yeah.
and it seemed like when he got to like he thought that was it. It was game over. But yeah,
I mean,
McRae.
sorry, go on.
No, go on, go on.
There are so many quietly brilliant science drives over his career that it would be really hard to select him. Yeah, no, absolutely. It sounds incredible.
McRae would go on to finish third after an absolute thriller of an event, putting a smile back on David Richards' face after a dismal start to the year. And Sainz would now lead the championship by 1 point going into the next round. And crazily, Mitsubishi would retain their lead in the manufacturer standings after their Group N cars won their class in a weird points situation. Don't ask me.
Yeah. It's a weird wild west of the WRC back then and a rotation age as well. It's very odd.
So yeah, as often has been the case, Portugal 1995 didn't disappoint, and I for one would have been thrilled to witness it. Dodgy crowds or no, it looked like to be a stunning event to watch and produced a proper battle between two real consummate professionals and world champions. Oddly enough, given the nature of the event, something that did stand out to me is Portugal is traditionally very attritional, like you've mentioned, the boulders and the bedrock. And while there was a few cloutings and bendings of steering arms as such, Kankinen came across. Delacour was the only retirement out of the top challengers, which is pretty. I think it's pretty significant on its own. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, Yeah, pretty good event. I know it did devolve into really a battle between two people quite early on, but I think that's where the story lies with it. And I just the fight back from signs and trading the lead multiple times, even though like Kankinen had far more stage wins over the course of the event. It just shows that once again, rallying can throw up any sort of a result.
I mean, you say it's a battle between just two, but when the just two are are two of the greats, and it's someone coming back from a seemingly insurmountable deficit, one that sides cop to as well, and I know all drivers play mind games, but I get the impression that Carlos, even then, wasn't really one of them. It probably, if it hadn't been for the weather, he knew he wouldn't really have stood a chance. So no, absolutely, an absolute crack at that.
Yeah, definitely one that stands out. But I mean, as I said earlier, I know 1995 gets recapped quite a bit, maybe more than it deserves. When there's plenty stuff to talk about in the World Championship, but yeah, I think that Sainz performance is one that really stands out.
I mean, it's talked about for reasons, and that it's like it's there. It's not for nothing, right? There's
No, no, and I'm not
the
saying it is.
no, no, I know, but the Toyota thing, the McRae thing, it's all there. The Sainz falling off his bike thing, it's got a movie script about it.
Yeah,
But
for
yes,
sure. So that brings us to an end of another retrospective issue. I was going to say we're not a print media outlet by any means. Another retrospective episode of Rally DNA. I hope you've enjoyed this chat about Portugal. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another interview with a current World Rally Championship competitor. And we'll follow that up with another retrospective for Rally Italy. We're saying Rally Italy rather than Rally Sardinia because, of course, that gives us a chance to talk about San Remo. Um, we won't both do it, and we'll have more of that content to come over the next few months. Thanks for sticking with us. I appreciate we've been away for a while. Um, Life has gotten in the way of podcast things. Unfortunately, we can't get to do this all the time. But it's been fun to come back, and we hope you all enjoy it and you've stuck with us until this point.
thanks very much, guys. Appreciate it as usual.
Thanks very much for listening and tune in a couple of weeks for another episode of Rally DNA.